Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Pull Up a Chair, a series dedicated to holding space for conversations about themes and topics related to food and people. My name is Chris Rodriguez, and today we will be discussing food, labor, and climate change with historian and professor Enrique Ochoa. During today's conversation, we will discuss the global climate impacts of food policies and how they affect the local communities and cultures that cultivate identity crops like maize. Most importantly, we'll discuss how we can address climate change and the threats facing our global food supply chains. We will do our best to lay out a broad scope, zooming in and out on these themes, while allowing time for you, our audience, to engage with us towards the latter part of our conversation. Before I continue with our introductions, I would like to express my sincerest gratitude for Ruby and all of the team in creating this wonderful platform. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to share a little bit about me and how I came to know our guest today. I grew up in Los Angeles and Baja California with roots in the Iberian Peninsula and across central Mexico. I'm a descendant of classically trained chefs, and I'm a 20-year veteran of the modern French culinary brigades. I hold a Bachelor of Arts in Gender, Ethnic, and Multicultural Studies and a Bachelor of Science in Hospitality Management from Cal Poly Pomona, with some graduate training in Latin American Studies at Cal State LA. During my undergraduate time, I was actively involved in student movements demanding healthier eating options for our campus community and also supporting immigrant rights coalitions and urban farming movements like the South Central Farmers. It was during this time that I enrolled in a class entitled Food, Power, and Culture, taught by Enrique Ochoa, and these are the themes that bring us to our discussion today. So now I'd like to introduce Enrique, who prefers not to go by his doctoral or professor titles. Uh, Enrique is a professor of Latin American Studies and History at Cal State LA. Enrique grew up on the San Gabriel Valley and was raised by his Sicilian American mother and Nicaraguan father, both of whom were middle school teachers. Enrique received their PhD at UCLA in history and has been teaching at Cal State LA since 1995. In 2013 and 2014, Enrique was named the President's Distinguished Professor. From 2006 to 2008, they held the Walter and Michi Wagelin Endowed Chair of Multicultural Studies at Cal Poly Pomona. The author and editor of multiple articles and several books, Enrique's research focuses on Mexican and Central American history, food studies, Latinx studies, immigration, and teaching history and intersectional ethnic studies in K through 16 classrooms and communities. Enrique, welcome to Pull Up a Chair. We are so pleased to have you with us today.
Thank you, Chris. It's really great to be here with you. Great to be with Ruby and to see all the exciting work you're doing, and looking forward to a really exciting conversation.
Wonderful. Yes, I'm very excited too. And so I think we should just jump right into some of the questions that I've set up for today. And first, if you could just begin by sharing a little bit about yourself and what shapes your approach to the work you do as a historian and educator.
Great. Yes, thanks. And I think, your introduction, our relationship as well, the way you described it and just being here captures a lot about what motivates me and what shaped my approach to teaching, research, and community work. As you talked about, right, our initial encounters in 2006, 2007, 2008, during the period of a lot of community activism around immigrant rights, around food justice, right? There was a big movement here about the South Central Farmers movement. All those things in our interactions really helped to kind of motivate me. That is, I draw from, right, the strengths of students, the ideas, the communities, the cultures, the knowledges that you all bring. And so So my interest in this course that we were teaching at that time, Food, Power, and Culture, was to teach about what was going on in Latin America, what was going on in the U.S. in working class communities around issues of globalization and NAFTA, and the way in which communities really were resisting and fighting back and trying to gain control over the food system. And so again, interaction with students, with community members, with activists like yourself, like your crew at the time, right, allowed me and pushed me to be able to see other ways of thinking about things. Again, your work, right, around in the kitchen, in food justice spaces, right, helped to push the way I see things and get me out of the academic mold and connect it to the community and develop it. So I'm really motivated by, again, my engagement with the community, with students, and the diverse knowledges. I come from a union family, a social justice oriented family. You had mentioned my parents as middle school teachers. My mother, Francesco Choa, right, is a Sicilian American whose parents were politically active when they migrated from Sicily into New York, and my grandfather was active in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and so social justice, right, was very important. Worker control, maintaining our communities ourselves, were very much there. And contradictions aside, of which there's always some, right, there was always kind of a strong push, even right from my father's family that migrated to from Nicaragua here, right, to stand up for what's right, to begin to see things in a more holistic way, not just in our divided way that we tend to see. Well, this is me in school, this is me at home, this is no, but how do we see things holistically, right? That we're whole people connected to whole communities, connected to a whole world, right, that is interacting with, right, the entire planet. So in this kind of more holistic kind of approaches. And for me, that is very important, right? That connection of that holistic, because I think even going through school, right, I felt, well, I think I was taught to be disconnected. I think one things we do in U.S. society, in Western capitalist patriarchal society, is divide us, get us to divide from each other, but also from ourselves, and connect and see, well, no, this is, again, right, chop ourselves up into little pieces, so to speak, and not see things holistically. And so as I began to study and began to focus, I was drawn to movements that were trying to connect and that are trying to make things whole again, to challenge the way in which colonialism beginning in 1492, capitalism, patriarchy, racism, right, that comes along with it, how those things were really meant to erase the communities that were here, erase indigenous people through genocide, enslave Africans and bring them over into the U.S., right, in a way that tried to deny their humanity and their ways of knowledge, and instead to try to impose a way of life and a way of thinking. And so communities, right, in resistance have long been trying to challenge that, and have been somewhat successful in maintaining and resisting and the like. And so for me, that kind of motivates me, right, to recapture that, to see what communities are doing, how they're drawing upon these ways of doing things, when all too often, right, we work even in the educational system in parts of U.S. society to erase those struggles, erase those experiences. And so I've been drawn to revolutionary movements seeking food and labor justice that are challenging those. The Zapatistas in Mexico, the revolutionary movements in Latin America, the landless movement trying to take land back and bring the people and the land and the community back as a whole, and other kind of community-based movements that are trying to do that. So those are some of the things, right, that have motivated me and that continue to motivate me both in my teaching and my research.
Wonderful, yes, and that's a big part of how we pulled the themes together for today's discussion. Is um, you know beginning to look at food and education Ruby is an online, world-renowned online culinary school. We have a global reach with many students across the globe, and so this platform, is being able to bring in these different discussions is critical, so that we can begin to reconnect, and really know how food is tied into these different themes that you touched on.
Mhm.
And so, kind of to now look at more of like a historical angle at uh, one of the topics that we wanted to center for today, looking at identity crops,
Mhm.
looking at climate change, and
Mhm.
how our food chains, our supply chains have evolved over time from
Mhm.
agricultural, well, we could say even beginning with hunting and gathering, um, and then early cultivation and agricultural societies, into what we are experiencing now, with just this global instant access to food.
Mhm.
um, so looking at maize as an identity crop, which I think it would be great to define what identity crops are, if you could
Mhm.
touch on that. um, and also, let's discuss a little bit about the historical significance of maize, and where does it originate, and if you could speak on that a little bit,
Sure.
as we move into this discussion. We'll zoom in on maize and bring it, zoom back out into the broader context.
Great. No, and that's a great question, right? And again, food, as you mentioned, right, aside from right nourishing our bodies and our souls and our spirit, right, also is a window into these processes, both the personal, the intimate, uh, right. Again, allow us to kind of think about gender and community and the political and land and the environment, and it opens up so much. And that is kind of this holistic approach is so central, again, given the way we tend to view things in our society at this point. And so when you raise the question, yes, about kind of identity crops and maize, right? Maíz, what we refer to, right, in English as maize, which emerges in the, I mean, of course, the name is a name that kind of comes from indigenous languages, right, in the Caribbean, and then gets adopted by the Spanish. But maíz emerges in right Mesoamerica, Central America, Mexico, um, 12, 13,000 years ago. Again, right, the archaeologists are still trying to date it, but been around for a long time, and has carried civilizations. So by identity crops, right, these then become not just commodities, right? Maize is not just a food or a product as we tend to see it in our modern capitalist society. Instead, right, it is about a way of life. It's about of people very connected to it. I love this great quote by Marco Sandoval, who's a Triqui elder, an indigenous elder from Oaxaca, and he's former director of the Museo Nacional de Culturas y Populares y Indígenas in Mexico. And he says, el maíz es una manera de ser y de vivir, right? Maize is a way of being and living. It relates us to, at the same time, to our Mother Earth, to the gods, and to everything around, right? To the living and to the dead. That is, right, for millennia, people have seen food and what they eat as part of who they were, who they are, as a way of being, as a way of life, and as a connection to the world all around, right, around them. It was about a relationship to the land, to the gods, to the people, going back there, to the living, to the dead, as he says, but also to right, other sentient beings, animal life, the live soil, the plants around, that is kind of how people have oftentimes, right, seen themselves. And this complex and multi-layered understanding of food, right, as part of who people are and the world around it, and not a separate thing, right, that emerges from early on. And then begins to be under assault, at least in the Western Hemisphere, in 1492, right, when Columbus begins the colonization process and the conquest process, where Western knowledge systems, then driven by colonialism and patriarchy and capitalism, work to make the Americas and everything else legible to it so that they can understand it and control it and transform it. Whereas, yeah, as you have there, the Popol Vuh, the Mayan Book of Life, the Book of Life of the Quiche Maya. And we can see this in many, many different oral stories and oral origin stories throughout the Americas and throughout central Mexico, right? In the Mayan Book of Life, people said, again, it's written that, yes, the gods first tried to make people using wood. They didn't like the way they came out. They tried then another substance, and ultimately then they took maize dough, maize, and the dough made it from it, right? Nixtamal, that maize dough, and then shaped it into people. And at the same time, used different varieties of maize, different colors of maize to create humans. You know, we have many of these stories as well, origin stories from the Mexica and Mexica oral lore, right? The so-called Aztec oral lore that talks about the god Quetzalcoatl transforming himself into an ant, going up into the mountains, finding a grain of corn, a grain of maize, bringing it back to the Valley of Mexico at the time in which humans are beginning to populate the earth, and then forging the basis of society based on that maize, right? Again, there are numerous other origin stories so that people are seen as the people of maize, gente de maiz, that, right, there's no direct disconnection between food and ourselves, between food, ourselves, and the land and the plants. So again, there's this deep connection in that discussion. This is an identity crop, right? And again, one can see this with rice in many Asian communities, right? In China and Japan, other communities in other areas develop these same kind of identity crops where it's not just a commodity or what people eat, but it is connected to a whole world view, a cosmovision. And we see that, and that makes this very unique. Then we have to think about tortillas and tamales and other other foods that emerge from maize, not just as a commodity. Yes, it may be bought and sold. Yes, it may be in restaurants, but there's a much deeper history there, a much deeper way of life, way of being that needs to be taken into consideration and should be thought about in that process. So this is kind of what we mean by it, right? Identity crops, and maize is a great example of this. That for centuries, right, people have seen themselves identified with it. Beginning with the colonization and conquest in 1492, then Europeans begin, right, to challenge that. And maize, as we can see from the slide there, it was always kind of from its inception and from its initial planting was always planted with other crops, intercropped, right, with beans and maize and squash as a way of, in both cases, all growing it together that protected each other. They together, right, the beans as well provided nitrogen to the soil, and so it was self-fertilizing. It protected it from weevils and other animals that might feed off it. This kind of intercropping of these three sisters, maize, frijol, and calabaza, with other supplemental foods, created a very strong plant-based diet, right, that persisted, that existed and persisted for thousands of years throughout the Americas. When meat was added, it was relatively small amount at certain times. And since there were very few large hooved animals in the Americas, right, what we now know as cows and pigs, right, those didn't exist. Instead, they drew from the great diversity of plant life that was there. And so maize Again, when we reduce it just to corn in this one item, right, as this one item, as we see grown in the U.S. and in the stores in the U.S., we miss that great diversity, the great biodiversity that has existed throughout the Americas for all these years. And with maize, you see it, right, that there are literally hundreds, actually at different times, thousands of different varieties of maize in different shapes, in different sizes, different colors, to be used based on different soils, different climates. Some maize to be used, right, to make pozole. Some maize better to be used to make masa for tortillas. Other maize is used for what? Atol, for the more corn-based drinks, for tamales, from a whole variety of different ones, for popcorn, right? All this requires different kinds of maize. And those knowledges were created over the course, right, of thousands of years. They were created. Those are technologies. Yes, that's scientific kind of thought and technology that were developed and in a scientific way, right? Trial and error. And that's all this knowledge.
Sorry. I was just going to jump in and add that there was a certain, like the original sort of genetic modification that went into creating maize. It's originally a grass before
Right.
it was actually, um, a grain, or and so that required like early genetic modification. We could argue, not like the genetic modification that we see today, which is stripping the grain from its nutrients and from this collective way of growing this the milpa that we saw earlier with the three sisters. And so how did we go from the milpa to this global commodification and the way it's cultivated in the US? I think it's about over 40% of US corn is grown not for consumption. Can we maybe touch a little bit on, the policies,
Yep.
global food policies, or kind of like, let's zoom out a little bit into these policies that have allowed for this huge shift
Right.
in how corn is grown, and
Great.
what is the reasoning for this current system that we have with our food production.
Great. Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And before we do that, Chris, maybe we could, if you don't mind, we can talk a little bit about the importance of the early maize and those knowledges and technologies that were there. Do you mind if we do that a little bit? Because I think the one we really need to center, right, and the importance there, in addition to the varieties and the cultivation practices that went on and that continue to get on, and those knowledges and seed saving still happens today, and migrants are bringing those seeds with them to different parts of the U.S., to different other areas, right, and they're maintaining those knowledges that are in those seeds. But also when we talk about tortillas, right, as we will, right? Tortillas as the basis of it, and the whole kind of maize dough, nixtamal, right? There's so much rich, deep, gendered histories and knowledges behind it, right? These are the whole process of making, taking the corn, right? Taking the maize from as a grain and then make it into dough in ways that have sustained communities for years, right, is a scientific technological process developed by indigenous women over the course of thousands of years. They developed nixtamalization to be able to take the corn, to add calcium hydroxide or cal or limestone water, right, using that, adding that to the mix, boiling it, so that the maize, then the grain, then is able to be peeled, and then it's easier to mash, right? Easier to form into dough, to take it and to make it in a masa. But it also scientifically adds amino acids, releases niacin, It's part of the vitamin B complex, right? That's not in maize as just grown off the stalk. That process enhances protein, and maize with frijol, right, with beans, it creates a complete protein. This is a really amazing, earth changing scientific process that's developed by indigenous women. Because if you just have maize, and when maize is taken after the colonization process to Africa, to Europe, to southern Italy, right? And where it becomes for poor people, for working people, the basis of life, like it does in southern Italy, and people eat it as polenta. And if that's all they're eating, right, they have niacin deficiency. They get pellagra, right, the horrible disease that leads to skin blistering and skin peeling and death ultimately. That never occurred in Central Mexico, never occurred in Mesoamerica, in Central America, because indigenous women had that knowledge and developed it over years, so that nutritiously it was there, right? That needs to be recognized. We don't recognize it when people are making tortillas or buying them at the store at this time, as you said, right, in this now period in which it's all kind of globalized and we don't think of what we eat. So yeah,
Absolutely.
I just really think we need to underscore that.
No, I think that's critical. And what would you say is the is so we can jump into the how the, maize's impact throughout the world, which you just touched on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, also within the culinary world, the modern culinary world, it's we've seen a huge uh, kind of this very popular embracing of taco, of the tortilla, from street from street food to ultra fine dining restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
um, what what do you think has led to that? What has led to that popularization of maize and corn?
Yeah. No, and that's a great question, right? And it connects to your previous question of this expansion that happens um, after the colonization and conquest, but well into the 18th and 19th and 20th century of kind of a development of a capitalist system that leads to, right, the usage of um, corn and maize all over the place, the globalization of it. That begins to happen right early on, like you just said, and I think a lot of it as well, right, beginning with migration of Mexicans in Central Americas to the U.S. In the early, of course, there were already large numbers of people who were here as well, right, before 1846 in the U.S. colonization or annexation of the Southwest, but even great migration from Mexico and Central America throughout the 20th century, right, brings those foods north. They bring the seeds, they bring the tortilla know-how, the technologies that were there, creating tortillerías and the like. And over time, some of that gets accepted by dominant classes in the US, but a lot of it really is still kind of seen as very, for want of a better term, right? Exactly. Inferior, something that wasn't really, is not what modern, quote unquote, modern civilized people should be eating. Instead, right, like the Spanish, the English would say as well, wheat-based diets are superior, quote unquote, meat-based diets as well. And so there was a great sense of this. It was inferior, and there was a kind of a war, and there's a persistent, if you will, war against war against maize-based communities, indigenous communities, that still
While trying
continues.
right, and you've in your work have covered this a lot extensively, the Americanization
Yeah.
process of migrant communities in the US through education, through home
Mm-hmm.
economic, through the household, promoting uh, uh, a ham and cheese sandwich is healthier for children than
Mm-hmm.
taco de frijol or taco de papa.
That's
um,
right.
all of this, with at the same time, rural communities being dispossessed from their lands and
Mhm.
uh, their land base, their
That's right.
maize, their agricultural land base. So there's this very
Mhm.
like intentional drive to shift the how food is being produced and consumed, and
Mhm.
assimilation. Um,
That's right. That's right. Yeah, there's that conscious degradation of that knowledge and those ways of being, while at the same time it's being appropriated and then modified and oftentimes disassociated from the indigenous communities, from Mexican and Central American communities. So at the same time, right, that policies that would be about right, getting people to eat ham and cheese sandwiches or just cheese sandwiches because that's cheaper and that's a more that's considered right a healthier diet, as you say. Even though, of course, we know right there's no truth to that at all. Even though that's being pushed, yeah. Then there's the creation of Spanish restaurants, quote unquote, Spanish Mexican restaurants, right, for certain populations.
the early 1900s, or
And
like
this is
industrial
yeah,
revolution.
this is during the early 1900s, and arguably it goes all the way up to the present. I think you could see it, right? I mean, the great example, right, of this is again in 2000 and 2010. In 2010, 2011, right, the United Nations made very two important declarations about food in Mexico. And the first one was from UNESCO, right, where after a couple times of trying, the UNESCO declared Mexican foodways, uh, indigenous foodways nourished by indigenous women over the course of a year as a international heritage recognition. Right, that this was at the same time. I think they gave that designation to French food as well, so that on the national international scene, those indigenous cuisines are all of a sudden seen as right something to be protected. At the next year, about 6 months later, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for food justice, right, around hunger, Olivier de Schutter, comes to Mexico and he says the vast majority, right, of working class Mexicanos, of indigenous peoples, face great food poverty. And so that food that UNESCO is saying is this great world heritage cuisine is out of the reach of large percentages of ancestors of the communities that produced it, that created it. They no longer have access to it. And instead, right, have much more access to fast food, to junk food, if you will. Comida chatarra is oftentimes called in Mexico as kind of a junk food diet. That it's much easier, it's much cheaper to purchase a Coke or a Pepsi, a packaged food item like gancitos or some other kind of like packaged processed food and eat that than it is to buy tortillas and beans. And so that there's a significant right
Incredible.
food poverty among indigenous communities. One in three indigenous children suffer from malnutrition, and you add to that as well, right, the growing epidemic of high sugar diets that then feeds, if you will, diabetes and type 2 diabetes, in which right indigenous communities are suffering that twin those twin aspects of malnourishment, lack of access to good and healthy food, and then of course type 2's diabetes and foodborne related diseases. Yeah, so that the contradiction is so glaring. It's just so glaring.
Fascinating. Well, I think we have a few questions coming in through through Ruby, and so maybe we can take a few and or a couple and continue
Sure.
on with our discussion. Um,
Great.
so I'll go ahead and I'm gonna go to I'm gonna go to Susan's question. are you plant based? I think either one of us could respond to that.
Mhm. Mhm.
And are we going to be able to afford food with this changing world and shipping costs? I can't
Yeah.
pay $5 for an avocado. This is I think this is a very real situation for many people
Right.
right now, vast majority.
Yeah.
Um, that takes us into a little bit more about like our global food supply chain
That's right.
now.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
do you have
No,
any
and
thoughts?
yeah, and I think Susan's question, right, is right on. The question really is, then, over the past, again, this has been a large process in the making, right, from centuries, but over the past 3 decades, in this period of more kind of hyper liberalization, we call it neoliberalization, right, or we might see it as globalization, that then all of a sudden, as you said earlier, Chris, right, people think, well, we need to be able to eat whatever we want to eat whenever we want it as soon as we can, which means then that if it's not produced here on the land locally, but I need to get access to it, we have to bring it in. And that might mean, yes, shipping it from Mexico, going to Chile, going to other places, other parts of the country. And all that costs, right? Not just the price, but the larger costs, what economists would call the externalities, right? But in reality is the cost of it's the real cost of our food, is that it comes from other places, and that requires all kinds of other, right, resources, to do it. Ones that kind of then are very damaging. Shipping, right? The shipping costs that people are paying higher shipping prices, in part because, yeah, to be able to bring something should cost a lot, because this kind of system that we've created, this globalized food system, is not sustainable. It's not sustainable.
It's the solution. It was a solution to world hunger, right? This
Yeah.
globalization and
Mm.
what is known as the Green Revolution to
Right.
introduce genetically modified seeds that are resilient to
Hmm.
pests and
Right.
the environment. And
Hmm.
so there's deep implications of this campaign that is tied into what you're describing, but it was
Right.
supposed to solve world hunger.
That's
um,
right.
and instead it's done the complete opposite and has had
Hmm.
devastating
Hmm.
effects on local ecologies, the communities, but
Hmm.
also bigger climate implications.
Right. Yeah. I would say, right, all those the usage of those technologies that argued, going back to the Green Revolution of the 40s and 50s, that there's a population crisis, quote unquote, and we're not going to have enough food, and therefore we have to use technology to, genetically modified food in a variety of ways, create new varieties to then produce a massive amount that will feed the world. I think that was a. I don't think it was really about feeding the world, right? I don't think that was the priority. The priority was, yes, producing quite a bit, but in the process, allowing these larger corporations to get access to those lands, right? To farmers' lands, to campesino lands, and then to produce kind of this less large monocropping. We won't see the three sisters anymore. We'll just see maize being planted. And then because the three sisters aren't there, right, they're not fixing beans are not nitrogen fixing the soil and fertilizing it. So we have to then get, right, industrial fertilizer. The other intercropping that would also address as well the kind of the bugs that would be eating it are then constructed as pests, and they need to be exterminated. And that extermination then needs to come from chemical solutions. And so all along that bolsters, right, some of these at one point rather small businesses, agribusinesses in the US and Europe. They now have come, right, through the Green Revolution, they have come out as, multi-billion-dollar corporations that have their hands in a lot of different aspects, as local knowledges, as peasants, as farmers have been pushed out, and their knowledge is pushed out, and in many cases reduced to workers, right? Low paid workers, and still in displaced. And
Dispossessed.
that's exactly it. Dispossessed in Spanish, right? The word despojo hits it really strongly because it's dispossession, but it's kind of a violent dispossession where people are
Of
forced.
their, yeah, of communal land, and then forced to migrate and, like you said, become workers
That's
to their
right.
own land, but also, you know, that no longer becomes a viable way of living, and so they're sort
That's
of
right.
forced into the consumer market as opposed to
Hmm.
being producers,
That's
um,
right.
with these milpas. I want to make sure that we can touch on how
Hmm.
communities are responding to
Yeah.
all of these drastic changes, and how
Hmm.
it's these technologies and these knowledges of the milpa, of growing
Hmm.
food for consumption as opposed to food for export, um,
Hmm.
through agroecology.
Right.
Um, if we could begin to touch on that a little bit, well,
Hmm.
maybe we can start to focus on that while taking some more questions.
Hmm.
Um, the next question here is from Ken. He asks, Chris and Enrique, would love to hear your thoughts more about how indigenous food systems practices might support cultural resilience among migrant workers living, working in the US.
Hmm. Yeah, no, no, great question, right? And connecting Ken's with Susan's question, right? I think, and as you say, to look at the way communities are responding, I think those knowledges, right? We know they're there, and we know they are being, right? They're coming with migrants, and people are bringing those systems with them. Um, However, right, the juggernaut of of industrial agriculture is there, and again, it is helping to kind of eclipse a lot of it. But you're right, Ken. I mean, this question of indigenous knowledges, um, the knowledges that communities are coming with, the great movement of agroecology in the U.S., right? So taking agricultural methods, connecting them to the ecology of the land, connecting them as well to indigenous ways of knowing and being, right? Are able to create sustainable um, communities and lands. And we see that movement, right, that has been kind of always in existence, but really, again, as part of this move towards free trade and NAFTA, the resistance of indigenous communities, of landed communities in connection with the agroecologists have really worked to kind of take land back where they're able to. And the great, I think you showed one of the pictures there, right, of the Zapatistas kind of taking land back and then beginning to say, okay, well, yes, let's draw upon our knowledges. Let's use some of the sciences, right, that are out there that agroecologists have had. Let's wed them together, and then let's focus on sustaining ourselves with the basics of right of beans, of maize, of calabaza, of chiles, right, of other foods, and not having to then import or depend on the state to provide some sort of subsidies to it, but instead to be able to go back to those knowledges and modernize them, right, and bring them up to speed with the different sciences that are there. And there are all kind of communities, right, that are doing that. And the potential, Ken, I think is there, right? The potential is there. The question, though, always still is, what access to land do people have, right? Even within the U.S., what access is there to land? Um, and I think, right, we see a lot of good examples that have been happening in Latin America, which has been where we've seen people and communities then say, well, this is enough. We need to then gain access to that land and be able to draw upon that so we can in part feed ourselves, but also, right, think very hard about sourcing sourcing things locally, um, thinking about eating seasonally, right, as opposed to having to ship things overseas and the things along those lines. So there's a lot of that community knowledge that's there. Now, it is in communities. It is in a variety of ways there. And there are these discussions and actual projects going on. And they fully, well, and I think they're sustaining, right? There's all kinds of very important ecological work that's being done that talks about, right, how small farmers throughout the world are the ones that sustain the majority of people, that the majority of our food and the majority of people are fed by small farmers. Yes, a large percentage is still, right, is by large agribusiness, but small farmers, community farmers, family farmers, driven by women farmers, right, are in the lead on that. And again, that's not looked at, right? Larger business, corporate notions of agriculture are not going to emphasize that. Instead, right, have to argue that they're the solution. Again, because that's kind of systemically built in there. But no, you're right. From the roots, from the grassroots, communities are resisting and are able to do it. And again, I think on the link, Chris, on the page, you have several really important videos centering campesinas. Maybe you want to mention a few of those that are there that kind of show those examples.
Right. On the Ruby event page for today's talk, there's a link that says to a PDF event document just to the side of our Enrique and my image and contact info. There in that document, you'll find links to important projects currently underway across Latin America, and some sort of touching on further readings. And of course, Enrique, your publications, there's link to your publications there as well, and some further readings also. So yes, we encourage our audience to take a look at that. And so we have there's quite a few questions in the chat, and so I'd like to in more of like in the methodical order, I'm going to go through and let's see. Pardon me. Okay, so I think here's a question. Shouldn't we be eating things that are growing regionally as opposed to shipping food products from all over the world, which adds to the costs? I live in colder climate, and we have seemed to have lost the ability to utilize grown foods throughout the year. This question is coming from Ted.
Yeah, no, right. Again, if we were speaking about a rational system, right, that was trying to sustain itself, that is so correct. We just have to realize, right, those are not the larger priorities of society. And so clearly individuals, right, can have those priorities, but we also have to remember that there's a larger systemic issues that are there. And again, those priorities, right, could become those of society at large, right? The speaking about these topics, the mobilizing around these topics, in addition to, right, the various economic crises that we're beginning to see happen around the skyrocketing price of food because of oil, because of all these other factors, right, show the unsustainability of it. And this is the time, I think, to begin to uplift those other projects, those other ways that are occurring, to show that, yeah, this is extremely viable alternative. And it is personally, and again, this goes back to Susan's thing about being plant-based and consciously about people's diet. And I work hard to be plant-based, but of course, I, as someone who also, right, knows, struggles with it in a variety of ways, it becomes very difficult. But one has to, right, think about that, but also think that this is also about larger structures. So it's not just about individual choice.
Absolutely. A question from Adante. How can we, as consumers, help heal these decades-long indigenous local supply chain shortages brought on by the superfoodification of native crops? Superfoodification. that's a great point. This kind of goes into we talked previously about how maize and many other products have been
Mm-hmm.
like recommodified
Mm-hmm.
again and
That's right.
appropriated. So
Yeah.
yes, that's a fascinating question.
Right, and then it goes to quinoa, right, which becomes the other, right, this superfood that then, yes, takes from Andean communities and cultures, and then all of a sudden massifies it, right, and then leads to kind of growing mass production, um, mass production of it in ways that are, yeah, that move it far afield from, right, indigenous peoples. Yeah, that's such an excellent point. And again, I think a lot of this, right, is to be done in conversation with indigenous communities, right, with native communities, in conjunction with communities. And again, I remember, Chris, right, uh, back in the day, you were doing really important work, with communities in Baja California, and at the same time, right, you were working um, in your degree, and you really wanted to bring fish, right, that was coming from an indigenous community in Baja California, and begin to source it directly from them, right, into the restaurant.
Right.
And
The
maybe you
at
want to.
Yeah, for the it was for the undergraduate program in hospitality. Yeah, it was sort of like uh, for me it was a no brainer,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just there's no system in place that allowed for that.
That's right.
And it was to do that to support an indigenous community in Baja California, the
Mm-hmm.
Cucapa, who for since time immemorial have lived um, in the Colorado Delta, where the Colorado River lets out into the Sea of Cortez.
Mm-hmm.
And with the development of big cities in the Southwest and urbanization, the Colorado River has been siphoned off to generate
Mm-hmm.
electricity by way of the Hoover Dam, and to also feed into the monocultural production of um, cattle feed, animal feed in the
Mm-hmm.
Coachella Valley, and so that's over time. This was also known as the California Water Wars, but that has had
Mm-hmm.
devastating impacts on the communities south of the border,
That's right.
just south of the All American Canal, which runs horizontally north on the U.S. side of the Mexican border. And as a result, the Colorado Delta has been drying up and making it very difficult for the Cucapa and other surrounding indigenous communities to practice their ancestral fishing. There, it's of striped sea bass, the corvina, which
Mm-hmm.
is now has become very popular in restaurants here in the U.S. Striped
Mm-hmm.
sea bass, Pacific striped sea bass. But 10 years ago, when we were working to support these communities who cannot compete with the big fisheries that come from other parts of the world, and over harvest the fish with big
Mm-hmm.
fishing nets. Yeah, I wanted to bring in some of the fish um, to serve during my week of running the restaurant, the student
Mm-hmm.
ran restaurant in my undergraduate program. And it was, yeah, it was not allowed, but for
Mm-hmm.
obvious reasons. We work with
Mm-hmm.
health department, and
Mm-hmm.
the infrastructure that we work. The fishing community needs to have their things in line, their protocols, so that it's all like a
Mm-hmm.
supervised, and
Right.
kind of the authorities have it all
Mm-hmm.
checked. But from like a purchaser or a chef to the fisher, which is there, if you have the right permits, but kind of like on an
Right.
individual basis, it's very difficult, or even
Mm-hmm.
small businesses. So yes,
Yeah.
but that has sort of changed over time a little bit. I think it's
Exactly.
um, getting easier, not for the Kukapa, but I think for other communities are working to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, right.
Especially like in the northwest, the northwest
Hmm.
fisheries with salmon, and there's a strong base of support for local fisheries in the northwest that
Hmm.
I've seen,
Yeah,
fish to like restaurant um, relationships.
that's right. Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
sorry, just quickly, right? I was going to say, yeah, in many ways, going back to Dante's question, right? The the way in which, right, folks have been sourcing food for a while from CSAs, from community sustainable agricultural centers, one could, right, begin to make those connections to local communities in ways that again are as well focused on more seasonal production. And again, I think those are ways to be thinking about, right, as consumers, as chefs, as you all are out there, right, to begin to ask that and talk about that, right, that propels it all forward, right. So it's not as difficult as it was when Chris was trying to do it, right, 10 years ago.
right, right. um, and there's many examples, and new technologies that
Mm-hmm.
are trying to also protect some of these. I'm focusing right now still on the fisheries, because like um, produce and grains, other sources of food have been impacted
That's right.
by these global food systems of factory farming and
Mm-hmm.
farm raised fish. So there's a lot of efforts taking underway to redirect those technologies to communities and rehabilitated environments and ecologies, that is run by the original caretakers of these
Mm-hmm.
food sources, which are the original peoples, indigenous and native
Mm-hmm.
peoples all around the world
Right.
who have this technology. And so
That's
it's
right.
we're seeing part of agroecology as a response to this
Mm-hmm.
global food system that is impacted the environment in negative ways, is returning to the ancestral knowledge, but also with the understanding and the very real situation that some of these ancestral technologies don't work today because the climate and the environment has changed so
Mm-hmm.
much.
Mm-hmm.
So we see it with corn and
That's right.
in Mesoamerica today, that traditional farming practices that were cosmological and also in line with how like the natural cycles with the moon and planting seasons, which were just knowledges passed down generation after
Mm-hmm.
generation, have shifted, and so
Right.
science is still required. Modern contemporary science needed to make adjustments,
Mm-hmm.
but coupling that with this ancestral knowledge and
That's right.
science to bring these food production back to localized methods,
Mm-hmm.
and localized consumption. So you know we could say this is a way of cutting out the middle person's structures that is sort of what agroecology does, and a very specific focus on cutting out the agrochemicals that kind
That's
of
right.
lock farmers into contracts that are just not viable.
Exactly.
It becomes inaccessible and almost like irrational to have farmers relying on purchasing agrochemicals that are destroying their land, their
Mm-hmm.
health, because it poisons the water, it poisons their
That's right.
lungs, and affects the children, um,
Yeah.
and the women in the communities. So agroecology is really about um, just doing away with all of that,
Mm-hmm.
and requires also a campaign to promote this technology throughout
Mm-hmm.
the communities as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because people
Yeah,
are used to using the chemicals. It's easier, but the
hmm,
health implications kind of, you know, um, are what are really provoking
right,
the communities to make a drastic shift right now, and we're seeing that as communities reintegrate agroecology, they become more resilient to
that's right,
climate disasters,
that's right,
and you know the devastating climate changes that are happening,
right.
hurricanes and whatnot.
That's right. I mean, so the agroecological approach, right, is then kind of a bringing us back into a more holistic way of seeing and doing things, and reconnecting communities, and again reconnecting folks to the land in ways that can, yes, slow it and make it, as you said, right, more resilient to the economic and the ecological disasters, right, that we're currently seeing. Yeah, that brings it back to holistic aspects, right? It then again sees us connected to the land, and it's not about commodifying the food in the same way, right? Because as you said, with the agrochemicals, with the growth of these large companies, right, like Monsanto, like others, there's the commodification of life that happens, right, in the gene. So that yes, the chemicals are going in, but pretty soon, right, does the farmer using those seed own the offspring of those seeds? Right, it gets,
An offspring. It's
and in many cases, right, there isn't, right, they're terminator seeds.
right,
They die
exactly.
afterward. Yes, and so again, right, that's all about that process of commodification that at one point begins to commodify maize and other food stuff, right, which is not the way they were intended to be initially, and then it goes all the way up to the more recent period where we're commodifying, right, seed life, and the knowledges that are there. When then there are these other more collective, more sustainable, right, more holistic approaches like agroecology that have always been in resistance and that are continuing and are expanding and are right around in different communities all throughout the U.S. and throughout the world. Again, you have to look for them in some cases, but it's much easier to find now than before.
Absolutely. We're if we can maybe just um, wrap up with one last response from you
Mm-hmm,
to how to maybe just if you could share one or two examples, like local examples in the U.S. There's countless, but I think it's really important for us to know that
mm-hmm,
this agroecological work is also um, very necessary
mm-hmm,
for us to be doing it here in our communities.
mm-hmm,
Um, there's this emergence of community gardens, the CSAs, as you mentioned, the community sustainable
mm-hmm.
agriculture. Um, but do you have maybe like one that has been like very inspirational to you, or that is doing
Yeah.
really critical work here in the U.S. that you'd like to just share for our audience to so that we can end
Mm-hmm.
on a hopeful note. I think hope is very important. um,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
uh,
No.
to like
Mhm,
share and also something for our audience to walk away with, to maybe
mhm,
perhaps look into their communities to get involved with.
yeah. No, I think that's so important, right? And again, keeping in mind, yes, that this is proliferating, these different, more food-based, sustainable movements, both in terms of, as you said, Chris, yeah, in the community gardens and in LA and in this area, right? They're proliferating. They're oftentimes emerging in many different places. I think of right um, various farms, various community-based farms in South LA that are happening, that are drawing from right kind of Black Panther notions of insurgent kind of feeding the community. I think as well of the way some of those are as well in the U.S. and in different communities are connected to the larger movement of farmers, of campesinos. And again, thinking of that local, but also with that global vision of groups like Via Campesina And I believe on one of those links, right, is something, one of the videos of Via Campesina and their and women and feminism in agriculture. Um, I, there's a
So that
document, yeah.
in the event, yeah, yeah, the
In the
link
event
is there.
document, yes, and I think in the event document as well, right, is that beautiful film, from the New York Times film of Claudia Serrato, right, making tamales and drawing upon the ancestral knowledge of her grandmother's recipe, but adding to it, drawing in as well, right, in those tamales, blue corn, making a kind of drawing from blue corn, which she's also inspired by, right, indigenous communities. And for meat, instead of using right, other traditional meats, is using buffalo, drawing from indigenous practices within the U.S. and the Indian food movement, Native American food movement here again. And that's a beautiful kind of example of what people are doing all over the place. Um, and again, it's those everyday acts, I think, that are really important, that helps to change those discourses, and then connecting it to these more larger movements. Again, I think as well, even though it's kind of slightly off, but I think it is closely connected around labor, right? The growing kind of labor organizing that's happening. We're seeing it clearly in different places, but with the pandemic, right, the growth of the realization, right, that people need to have sustainable lives, even when they're working in restaurants, when they're working in the food processes and packaging, and beginning to make those connections with who produces our food, who is serving our food, where is that coming, how can we connect to it. So when we think of supply chains, right, the word always gets me, right, because it's so disembodied, it's so dehumanizing. We're really thinking about supply chains. We're really thinking about people, communities, the land, right, the different mechanisms of their labor that gets things to us, right. I think if we begin to see that holistically, in ways that we're connected to who's producing the food, to who's washing it, to who's serving it, to who's transporting it, right, I think we begin to think of it differently.
Wonderful, and I'm really glad that you touched on that last piece of labor um, and just rethinking the supply chain in that way to humanize it and make those connections. So I think that's a great point to bring our conversation full circle. And I want to thank you very much, Enrique, for joining us today and for
Thank
Pull Up
you.
a Chair. Thank you to Ruby and all of the team, to all of the back end tech support, making this all possible. Thank you all so much, and thank you to our audience, to our students,
Thank you.
and the broader community for attending. And we look forward to coming back again with future episodes. Please follow Ruby for future events, our live events page, and we look forward to the next one. Thank you so much, Enrique. If you'd like to say goodbye, we'll end it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great. It was great to be with you all.